friends, welcome to my channel and welcome to yet another important video in the history of English literature series. So far we have covered 4 videos in this series and we have also covered 4 ages in those 4 videos, namely Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Norman, Age of Chaucer and Age of Revival. And today in this 5th video we are going to talk about Elizabethan period. Elizabethan period is said to be one of the most important period in the history of English literature. This is known as the golden period. Why? Because some really amazing writers, some really prominent writers were born in this period and they started writing in this period. And one such example is Mr. William Shakespeare. So Elizabethan period started in the year 1558 and it continued till 1603. And during this period, a lot of important socio-economic changes happened in England. The first important thing in regards to this period is that Elizabeth, the queen, the great queen, was ruling England during this period. She is known as the Virgin Queen because she never married, and she brought a lot of political stability in England because she was the queen during whose period England was very stable. As we saw in the Age of Revival that various wars were taking place in regards to France and England, and also civil war was taking place between the houses of York and Lancaster in England itself. But during this period of Elizabethan age, there were no wars, and because there were no wars, people started working towards various other art forms. And one such art form was literature. Also at the same time, in the Age of Revival, we saw that printing press came to England. And now that printing press is in England, a lot of books can be written and can be circulated in the society. So printing press was one such invention which changed how literature was seen in England. At the same time, this was a period when a lot of sailors went to distant lands and new lands were discovered by England. So it was this time when Columbus went into a sail and he discovered one of the most finest countries. At the same time, you find that British colonization, the period where Britain started colonizing so many nations, this was the period when all of that started. So in short, as you can see that a lot of good changes were happening in and across England during this period, and one of the most important change that you must understand in order to understand the literature, and that is Renaissance. So this was a period when Renaissance came into England. Now what is Renaissance? We are going to discuss it very soon in our video, but before that you must remember the fact that Renaissance was a movement that started in Italy, but during the Elizabethan period it started having an impact on England itself. So that is the reason why this period is known as Elizabethan period, and some people also called it as the English Renaissance. So Renaissance began in 14th century when people started taking interest in the learnings of the ancient civilizations, specifically of Greek and Roman civilization. So Renaissance, if you look at the term, means rebirth. So rebirth of what? Rebirth of the ancient Roman and Greek civilization. People were so amazed by the ancient Roman culture, civilization, their art forms, that they sort of wanted that to come back, and that is how Renaissance began. Now what you need to understand here when it comes to Renaissance is that Renaissance began in Italy, which is said to be the birthplace, because Rome was the center of Renaissance. Rome is one of the cities in Italy, and Rome was the capital of Roman civilization. So during Roman civilization, all the major operations happened in the city of Rome, which now is a part of Italy. So Italy is said to be the birthplace of Renaissance, where all the Roman architecture, art forms are readily visible. Now these people coming from the northern parts of Europe, they visited Italy and they were dazzled by the Roman art forms, their literature, their culture, and they had this love of Renaissance inside them which they carried when they settled in their own countries like Germany, Spain, England. And that is how Renaissance spread all across Europe during the 14th and 15th century. What you also need to understand here is that Renaissance spread across Europe by a phenomena called cultural diffusion. Now, when it comes to Renaissance, two other important terms that you might come across are cultural diffusion and Renaissance humanism. Now, let us understand them one by one. Cultural diffusion is basically the idea where the main idea is spreading across from a center point to others. So just like Renaissance began in Italy and it branched out to other parts of Europe, similarly if we have any idea that has a center point and from there it moves on to the other path, that is called cultural diffusion. And then we have humanism. What is humanism? Humanism is a philosophy which says that humans have worth, dignity and power. So humanism basically believes that life should be centered around humanity and reason, and it should not be centered around church and its regulation. So we all know that before Renaissance came into England, church was having supreme power over everybody. So even the plays, literature, art, everything was centered around church. But when Renaissance came, they kind of started with the idea that humans are important. Humans are the finest creation of God, and therefore life should be centered around reason, which is one of the most important faculty of humans, and it should be centered around humanity, and it should not be centered around Bible and church and its regulations. Now that we had a detailed discussion on Renaissance and on the Elizabethan period, it is time to look at some famous literary works and some important writers. If you look at the works written during the Elizabethan period, you will find that they belong to either of these two categories. Either they were dramas written by playwrights, or they were poets and some famous sonnets written by them. Novels did not start during this period, so there were no novels. At times there were some pamphlets and essays written by writers like Francis Bacon and Robert Greene, but they were not so important. So in this particular lecture, I am going to take you through the major dramatists and the major poets. Though it is not possible for me to cover each of them in detail because of the time crunch, if you want detailed lectures on these writers, you can refer to my online course where I cover each of them in detail. So there are more than 20 lectures on university wits, 18 lectures on William Shakespeare, which I have discussed in my online course. In this particular YouTube video, I'm going to quickly take you through the major dramatists and through the major poets. If you want the detailed list of writers, you can get it free of cost on my website arpitakarwa.com. Now let us look at the major dramatists who were writing during this period. Without any doubt, we have William Shakespeare as the most important dramatist, but I have already made 2 detailed videos on William Shakespeare in my YouTube channel. You can go and watch them. So I'm not going to talk about him so much in this particular video. I'm going to instead take time and talk about the University Wits. University Wits was a writing group which is said to be the first professional group who came into the field of writing in Elizabethan period. This group had 7 members. 3 of them were graduated from Cambridge, 3 of them graduated from Oxford, and 1, who is Thomas Cridd, he did not go to Oxford or to Cambridge. Now if you look at these 7 writers, these are most important writers who started writing before Shakespeare came into the scene, and these people took literature and writing as their career. अभी तक जितने भी writers एज ऑफ चॉसर, एज ऑफ रिवाइवल या नॉर्मन पीरियड में लिख रहे थे, वो सब राइटिंग के साथ में और भी बहुत कुछ कर रहे थे. राइटिंग वॉज जस्ट लाइक अ हॉबी टू देम, बट यूनिवर्सिटी विट्स के लिए राइटिंग वॉज देयर प्रोफेशन. writing. So these were poets, these were writers, and these were pamphleteers. One most important pamphlet that was written by Robert Greene, who is a part of University Wit, is known as Brought with Millions of Repentance. This was a passage where he talked about Shakespeare and his writing talent, and he calls Shakespeare as upstart crow beautified with our feathers. So basically he is appreciating Shakespeare's work, Shakespeare's writing. On the other hand, we have some amazing works written by Christopher Marlowe like Dr. Faustus, which is centered on the idea of Renaissance humanism. तो Faustus का जो कैरेक्टर है वो दिखाता है कि ह्यूमन रीजन कितना इम्पोर्टेंट है, बट एट द सेम टाइम इट शोकेसेस द फ्लॉज इन रेनेसां ह्यूमनिज्म. कहीं ना कहीं अभी भी चर्च का इन्फ्लुएंस बहुत ज़्यादा हमें दिख पाता है. सो दिस वॉज अबाउट the dramatists who were very, very important and who were writing during the Elizabethan period. Let us now take a look at the major poets and some amazing poetry written by them. Elizabethan period was blessed with so many amazing poets who were mostly writing sonnets, because sonnets was the most popular form of writing during this period, and we all know that it was Henry Howard and Thomas Watt who contributed to blank verse and sonnets. There is an entire lecture on these two writers and their contribution in the field of literature, though we don't know them today, but it was because of them that blank verse, which was the most popular kind of literary writing that Shakespeare even used and mastered, was done by these two people. So it was Henry Howard and Thomas Watt who brought blank verse and sonnets into the scene. On top of that, we have writers like Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser who did some amazing work in the field of poetry. Edmund Spenser की अगर हम बात करें तो Spenser is said to be the poet's poet, and it was Spenser's poetry which somewhere started the Elizabethan period. And you will be amazed to know that the poetry's name was Shepherd's Calendar, which he dedicated to a friend of his, whose name is none other than Sir Philip Sidney. So Philip Sidney was a very good friend of Edmund Spenser, and Spenser dedicated Shepherd's Calendar to Sidney. He is known as the poet's poet, as well as it was his poetry which kind of kick-started the Elizabethan period. On the other hand, we have William Shakespeare. Now, for Shakespeare, I don't think I would be able to do justice if I start talking about his sonnet collection in this particular lecture, because he has written some fabulous sonnets which are very dear to my heart. You can refer to my other lectures on William Shakespeare, which is available on my YouTube channel for detailed study of the same. And finally, we land on to the last poet that we are going to discuss in this particular lecture, who is Sir Philip Sidney. Philip Sidney is known as the Renaissance man, the perfect Renaissance man. Why? Because if you look at Philip Sidney, he was a courtier, he was a soldier, he was a writer, he was a man of philosophy. So he was a kind of person who had everything in himself, and he met with a very tragic death. So Philip Sidney की अगर हम बात करें, so he died on a war front where he was thirsty, he wanted water. When he got the water, he found that another soldier was thirsty, so he gave his water to that man, and that is how he died. So you can look at the epitome of love and care this man demonstrated. But he did not only do justice to humanity, but at the same time he became the first literary critic in the field of English literature by writing a famous work, and I'm pretty sure that you must have heard about this work in either your bachelor's or your master's. And if you know the work that was written by him in the field of literary criticism, make sure you comment in the section below and let me see how many of you get it right. So with that note, we complete our discussion on the Elizabethan age, where we have discussed about the socio-political condition, we've discussed about the major dramatists and the major poets.